Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Psychedelics and the Future of Religion event for the spring 2026 semester, Transcendence, Transformation, and Trans-Psychedelia. My name is Paul Gillis-Smith, Program Lead for the Psychedelics and Spirituality Initiative at the Center for the Study of World Religions. The Psychedelics and the Future of Religion series is now in its fifth year. It is an important node in the psychedelics research at the center. This initiative is embedded in the center's ongoing and evolving Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, or TNT for short. If you're interested in our psychedelics programming, the TNT initiative, or other research and programming happening here at the center, we will put a link to the center's homepage and newsletter sign up in the chat function. The CSWR is also part of the Harvard Study of Psychedelics in Society and Culture. We will also put a link to the study's homepage and newsletter sign up in the chat if you're interested in this Harvard-wide initiative. There they are. Now, for today's event, Transcendence, Transformation, and Trans-Psychedelia, we are joined by Professors Hil Malatino and Susan Stryker. Now, to give a sense of how the conversation will unfold, in a moment, I will turn the floor over to Hil and Susan, who will each provide remarks on these themes. Following their presentations, the three of us will appear on screen together to continue the discussion and answer questions from the audience. And please submit your questions at any point during the event through the Zoom Q&A tab. Now, I posed a similar question at the beginning of an event that the CSWR hosted last semester on raving, but I think it is also relevant to our conversation today. Why talk about the intersection of gender transition and psychedelics at a center for the study of world religions? To put it plainly, public discourse about both psychedelics and gender transition are often constrained by a similar appeal to medicine. Psychedelics have gained traction recently in great part due to their alleged medical benefits, and one can look no further than Rand's recent report on public opinion on legalizing psychedelics that was released earlier this week. For more on that. And similarly, in order to receive certain types of care, people who change gender must do so primarily through medical channels and as patients, or at least are thought to do so. For both the use of psychedelics and for gender transition, this framing obscures a rich history in which both of these modes of being have been sites of religious experimentation and metaphysical speculation, and sometimes even in combination with one another. Such practices of combination we might call trans-psychedelia, and have unfolded historically through encounters with indigenous religious traditions, communication with the more than human world in altered states, and in theories of transformation that exceed the limits of biomedicine. Now, as I have thought through these historic parallels between psychedelics and changing gender, I found no one better to discuss their points of contact, their admixtures, and the tensions that these histories evoke than Hil Malatino and Susan Stryker. Now, beyond this exploration of trans-psychedelia, my other hope is that in this forum, we might contribute to a public conversation on gender transition. I have found this public conversation increasingly imperiled by a demand that trans people defend their right to exist. This forum will not make that demand. This hope is also a request. As you pose questions in the Q&A function, that your questions do not imply such a demand from our speakers to defend their or any trans person's right to exist. With that, I will introduce Hil. Hil Malatino is Joyce L. and Douglas S. Sherwin Early Career Professor in the Rock Ethics Institute and Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Philosophy at Penn State University. He's the author of Climbing, which is forthcoming from Duke in their Practices series, Side Affects on Being Trans and Feeling Bad from the University of Minnesota, which I recommend you acquire yourself as well. Trans Care, also from the University of Minnesota, and Queer Embodiment, Monstrosity, Medical Violence, and Intersex Experience. He's also the co-editor of the T for T issue of the Trans Studies Quarterly, alongside Cam Awkward-Rich, and the Care, Ethics, Otherwise issue of Essays in Philosophy, alongside Sarah Clark Miller and Amy McKiernan. His essays have appeared in Hypatia, TSQ, Signs, and many other journals and edited volumes. He is a Lambda Literary Award finalist and recipient of the Leslie Feinberg Award in Trans Literature. Hil, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to jump into it because I feel like my comments went maybe a little long and I want to give a lot of time for a conversation. Um, I'm working on this project on this guy, Reed Erickson, who I'll tell you more about in a moment if you don't know about him. And I've been procrastinating writing this chapter that's specifically on his relationship with ketamine, filtered through his friendship with John Lilly, who's a man that some of you may know, but you'll know more about him after this if you don't. And I've been procrastinating writing it because I feel in many ways out of my depth. I'm having to develop a lot of sort of new intellectual competencies to do justice to this material. And my hope is that Susan and Paul and folks that are here in the webinar can help me think through some of the messier parts of this project. So that said, I'm just going to jump in. It's May 2023, and I've booked a room at a budget motel off Blanchard Street in Victoria, British Columbia. It's just north of downtown, where the crowds of early season tourists give way to big box stores. I, a little more than newly sober, drank tall boys of non-alcoholic beer and watched the island wind whip through a pair of flags, Canadian, Pride, outside the plate glass, backgrounded by the concrete exterior of a designer shoe warehouse. I'm here for 2 weeks, and my aim is to make it through a decent chunk of Reed Erickson's archive. I've also decided to document the process. So I've opened a file on my laptop, left it blank, cursor blinking, and saved it as the Erickson Journals. I walk away from the window and towards it, where I write this. Who's Reed Erickson? A trans guy from the 20th century. American, USian, a white guy from a wealthy family who, like all wealthy families, lived on money that was likely ill-gotten. He had a big cat as a pet. A snow leopard, maybe a cheetah, maybe just a regular leopard. He spent a fair bit of time in Mexico. He also had property in Louisiana. He funded one magazine, an institute in Los Angeles. He funded trans research, both medical and competency-oriented, via the Erickson Educational Fund. He funded research in human dolphin communication. He died. I seem to think he died tragically. He did drugs. I suspect he did a lot of drugs, ketamine, other psychotropics, cocaine, and I suspect this both because of the reputation he's accrued over the decades since his death, the big cat, the dolphins, and also because of the art of his that I've seen reproduced in digital archives and essays where other writers grapple with his legacy and place in the history of transactivism. It's psychedelic. I'm not sure what the formal conventions of a psychedelic artwork are, if there are any. I just know the kind of art people produce in the afterglow. I grew up with it. My dad and his alien heads and my big brother's mandalas, the swirls and fractals, the obsession with cohesion and scale, with consciousness and the infinite, with the wild complexity of the so-called natural world, with the intense cognition that one is not at all separate from this so-called natural world. I think of him as a very 70s dude, caught up in transformational mysticism, engaged in bringing about a radical shift in the order of things, a little outlaw, a little excessive, maybe overzealous in his vision, worn out by it. I think of him as a bridge figure, pushing against the respectability politics that gatekept transition in the 1950s and 60s, obviously a freak and leaning very hard into it, helping bring the trans worlds that I encountered in the 90s and aughts, full of freaks who leaned very hard into it, into being. Why am I obsessed with him? I don't know if obsession is the right word, even as I start research for what may be a book entirely about him. His story feels apocryphal, passed around, embroidered, embellished, but also totally outsized and outrageous to begin with. It's a hook I've hung other thoughts on for years. Thoughts about the role of private philanthropy in expanding access and awareness, about drug use and trans arts of living, about intimacies between the human and non-human, about mysticism and trans world making, about transmasc fashion, about wealth and whiteness and existential permission, about loneliness and isolation, about addiction, and about madness. Okay, so I jotted these notes down the night before my first day in the archives, wanting to document the sense I had of the figure whose traces I was about to encounter, replete with my misconstruals, projections, and investments in the mythology that had come over some years to surround him. I had listened to a couple of podcasts about him prior, had watched some video art that Chris Vargas made, chatted with a very small handful of friends and colleagues who were similarly interested in him, his obvious strangeness, his underrepresentation in trans and queer histories, of the mid-20th century. A.J. Lewis, who has written, I think, some of the best material at the nexus of transpolitics and post-secular studies, focused largely on trans cultures in the 1970s and queer cultures more broadly, asked if I'd been to his archives yet. I said no. He said, "Good luck making heads or tails of what I found there." So there I was, a year or so later, about to embark on the project of making heads or tails. The Erickson accession was collated by Aaron DeVore, the outgoing chair in transgender studies at the University of Victoria. It was the collection that established the transgender archives there and is voluminous, though incomplete. Many materials, some duplicates, some not, are housed at the One Archives at USC. Others are in a smaller private collection that DeVore stewards. While he was sorting the materials, he established a folder to house the doodles and frenetic notes that Erickson scribbled while he was high. They're filed under Art and Ravings. These materials have a kind of magnetic pull. They're clustered amidst endless legal documents. Erickson was quite litigious in his later years, and reams of print ephemera, from back issues of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology to receipts for the ketamine he imported from Mexico. I suspect for many time-strapped researchers, they are one of the must-see components of the collection. This means, of course, that many folks are viewing these documents without engaging in other materials in the archives, which means minimally that some context is missing. When AJ warned me of the stubborn opacity of the materials I'd encounter, I think this is what he was referring to. But I was intrepid. I had time, I had research funds, I had a strong will to figure out what he was on about. I would get to the bottom of whatever there was there. That is, of course, not at all what has happened. What did happen is that my initial interest in Erickson, which sprung from an engagement with trans experiments with New Age spirituality over the latter half of the 20th century, has sprawled to include multiple side quests. These are some: the history of psychedelic therapy, the forms of esoteric knowledge that circulated in Southern and Central California in the 1970s and 1980s, specifically the circuit running between Esalen, ground zero of the human potential movement on the cliffside in Big Sur, and Ojai, Erickson's primary site of residence in that decade of the 70s, and a long-standing center of theosophical study. Experimental ketamine research and ketamine addiction, humanistic and transpersonal psychology, Christian Science, past life regression, and Cold War eschatological panic. To say that I found myself out of my depth, an agnostic, a recovering alcoholic, a feminist materialist, and a punk who had been raised by hippies and rebelled by dismissing much of what my parents were spiritually and intellectually invested in, at least at first, would be a massive understatement. But I have felt moved to grapple with Erickson's legacy, and especially dissatisfied with the relegation of the voluminous notes he made while under the influence of both ketamine and cocaine to the status of ravings. There's something troubling about the reduction to nonsense, which is not to say I cannot understand the move to classify them as such. They are, indeed, difficult to read, characterized by paranoia, cyclical obsessive repetitions, wild speculations, and a deep conviction in a world beyond prevailing consensus reality. But taking these writings seriously doesn't mean that I'm arguing there is necessarily a kind of wisdom in what is perceived, maybe by some in these materials, as madness, though sometimes there is, certainly. It's simply this. I think that the task of a researcher is to pay attention and somehow synthesize and contextualize that which is provided by the subject of your attention. Because of that, it seems that one must do something beyond dismiss these writings as illegible, irrational, deluded, fevered byproducts of hallucination. It's a small step from there to engaging such experiences on terms that exceed a binary of sense and nonsense, in the concomitant binaries of fact and belief, truth and delusion, the secular and the spiritual. Okay, so how did Erickson get into ketamine in the first place? He established the Erickson Educational Foundation in 1964, leveraging a family fortune to, in the words of the mission statement, quote, provide assistance and support in areas where human potential was limited by adverse physical, mental, or social conditions, or where the scope of research was too new, controversial, or imaginative to receive traditionally oriented support, end quote. The mention of human potential here is imperative to note. From day one, the EEF, which has come to be known primarily for its funding of trans-related research, education, outreach, and advocacy, was directly allying itself with the human potential movement, was a syncretic amalgamation of the principles, human potential movement, This movement, elaborated and popularized by the work of the Esalen Institute and Big Sur, was a syncretic amalgamation of the principles of humanistic psychology, particularly the importance of mindfulness and self-reflection in the pursuit of self-actualization, certain strands of esoteric knowledge, an engagement with Eastern religious thought, and an embrace of developments in scientific research that supported their developing epistemology of collective transformation via persistent personal betterment. Esalen was established in 1962. Erickson's choice of wording in the mission statement of the EEF in 1964 was very deliberate. Though he was based in Baton Rouge when he began the EEF, he was in significant contact with the world of mid-20th century sexology. He had begun hormonal transition with the assistance of Harry Benjamin in the early 1960s and funded another foundation, the Harry Benjamin Foundation, before he formed the EEF. The roster of names on the board of this foundation reads as a veritable who's who of mid-century sexology. There was Wardell Pomeroy, a collaborator with Alfred Kinsey on the Kinsey Reports. There was John Money, the pioneering and now infamous sexologist that coined the terms gender role and gender identity in the mid-1950s, although Susan will complicate that narrative for us, I think, in a moment. There was Richard Green, a Johns Hopkins psychiatrist that had trained under Money and would become a prominent specialist in trans medicine, eventually leading the World Professional Association for Transgender Health in the 1990s. Leo Woolman, a gynecologist with a side interest in hypnosis who made a name for himself as a trans-affirming surgeon, was an advisor. So was Ira Polly, a hunky former All-American football star at UCLA who was part of an early wave of psychiatrists who endorsed surgical and hormonal treatment for trans subjects. He's responsible for proposing a separation between genuine and pseudo-transsexuals that sought to weed out subjects seeking transition as a kind of misled cure for homosexual desire. The organization's raison d'etre, as reported in a 1966 mission statement, was, quote, supporting sex research in order to help break its neglect and end the taboo on finding out what and how widespread the problems really are, unquote. They were operating in a deeply conflictual landscape, hindered by moralizing prejudice. Nevertheless, they had the goal of developing an account of transsexuality that would help trans people, in their words, understand better the correlates and inceptions of their conditions, end quote, and develop what they considered to be realistic treatment plans. The research proceeded by agglomerating case studies comprised of psychiatric, endocrinological, and neurological evaluations. So, it was through his involvement with these men that Erickson would become interested in the human potential movement. There was much cross-traffic between mid-century sexology and transpersonal psychology. Both areas of research were underwritten by companion ideologies that heavily stressed questions of becoming and self-actualization, and understood scientific research as a handmaiden to the attainment of individual and collective wellness. If we read Erickson's decision to open the EEF in relation to his prior support of the Harry Benjamin Foundation, it becomes clear that his decision is an expansion of his field of philanthropic work beyond trans medicine and into human potential. With this expansion, he would encounter John Lilly, a polymathic psychonaut in cahoots with the major figures of psychedelic counterculture who were cycling through Big Sur. Ram Dass, Timothy Leary, Werner Erhard, you know all of them. He would partially fund Lilly's research on human-dolphin communication, which has become a cornerstone of the Erickson mythology. But the relationship went well beyond that of funder and fundee. Lilly became the godfather to Erickson's children, and the two became drug buddies. Lilly began experimenting with ketamine in the 1970s and kept extensive accounts of his experiences with the drug, sometimes in combination with the use of a flotation tank, a technology he helped to create and refine. Erickson followed suit, engaging in practices of isolation and high-dose ketamine use and attempting, though relatively unsuccessfully, at least from what I've seen, to keep a log of his experiences. The notes that survive in the archive often assiduously note date, time, substance ingested, background music, and scent of choice. He was a firm believer in the importance of set and setting, and he often sprayed a cloth with the cologne gray flannel so that he could inhale it during his journey. But the recording of psychic experience during his time under influence is pretty scant, what I can tell. John Lilly's is the converse. Enormous transcripts of recordings can be found in his archives, and some have migrated over to Erickson's as well. But what is clear is that Erickson understood himself to be partaking in the robust tradition of psychedelic self-experimentation, a psychonaut as well as a gendernaut, a guy who wasn't afraid to try things out. Perhaps to a fault or towards disastrous ends, his life ended in a tragic state, struggling with addiction and a radical breakdown in his health, while fleeing drug charges and residing in Mazatlan. As Susan once said to me when I asked her about him, and I don't know if she'll remember this, but, quote, he was so credulous his brain was liable to fall out of his head, end quote. He was attracted to the dissociative effects of ketamine and found he could not get enough of it. He started planning a conference on the therapeutic uses of ketamine to be held at Esalen. He titled this conference The Keys to the Kingdom, and he meant the kingdom of God, quite literally. He called ketamine colloquially Key K because he thought it was one way to open the door to that kingdom. Erickson got cold feet, however, possibly worried about being linked to the importation of ketamine, and the conference never happened. Well, it's a bummer to not have access to the proceedings of a conference that never was. It's still the case that he left many traces that attend to his his experience with ketamine. They're often characterized by the experience of deep time, a preoccupation with lineage and kinship, the past lives and inheritances that have produced him as he currently manifests. This rhymes with some of Susan's writing in the Ketamine Journal she published in 2019 that's included in When Monsters Speak, when she describes experiencing her body while on K as, quote, the convergent point of innumerable brightly colored storylines, like yarn threaded through a hole where a nail once was, end quote. But then she goes on, comprised of short lines of proximal narratives and longer transgenerational arcs. It also resonates with Sheila Heti's recent account of her experience with high-dose ketamine therapy, which she describes as, quote, a thick and slow panning across my whole life, end quote, stretching back before birth. She writes of recognizing that she had once been a fetus and that she had really been born, that the past was a real place and that she had been there. Ketamine seems to offer the experience of a spiraling time and a deep recognition of one's imaginations within it. I've become curious as to what this experience offered Erickson in relation to transition and his understanding of gendered embodiment. So, to conclude, here he is in 1975 writing a note to Zelda Supley, the woman who helped him run the Erickson Educational Foundation, for a book on transsexuality in the New Age that also, sadly, never came to fruition. In the archives, it's sandwiched in between a reminder to send his friend Marcia a caftan and a list of vinyl records, all classical, that he wanted to have replaced because his copies were scratched. He writes, quote, the incidence of TS, or transsexuals, is just another illustration of how stupid, in all capitals, humans are in trying to set up a limited number of categories for the infinitude of God's kingdom. There is no such thing as male and female. Any definition of maleness or femaleness would have to be arbitrary. Recognize it as such, and don't expect nature, capital N, or people's nature, small n, to take heed of human divisions. He goes on, you are you. If another finds this unsatisfactory, that is his or her problem, not yours, even though there are those who try to make it seem so, including society, in scare quotes, doctors, psychiatrists, parents, etc. But all of those wise men speak through ignorance, ignorance of divine law, capital D, capital L, and ignorance of your personal integrity, capital I. For Reed, to be trans is to be in possession of a form of self-knowing that is fundamentally at odds with and necessarily distrustful of both institutional authority and any taxonomical logic currently on offer. He doesn't search for an etiology of transsexuality. He's not concerned with why he is the way he is, but he's convinced that it is a question that extant sciences will be unable to satisfactorily answer. Human categories and their modes of inhabitants are limited, arbitrary. Reed says they're stupid. I feel that. They're heavy-handed reductions of the manifold complexities of being enfleshed in this world. Reed says what humans term sex or gender is just an assortment of polarities, some of which are visible, but the polarities are many and transdimensional and in the main, invisible. End quote. It's of a piece with his involvement with the forms of New Age thought emanating from Esalen in the 1970s. Esoteric scholar Wouter Hanegraaff characterizes it as a variant of an old concept of Platonic mediation, shaped by humans striving towards unification with divinity, which has become popularized and psychologized in modern formulations such as self-realization or finding one's true self, an ideal that does not imply passive submission to God or the annihilation of individuality, but rather spiritual empowerment and the unfolding of one's full human potential. For Erickson, gender is nothing in the face of such self-actualization after so many lives. Okay, that's where I'll stop. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Hil. Lots there for us to chew on. Just a reminder of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to put any questions that you may have or that Hil's remarks inspired. Next up, we have Dr. Susan Stryker. She is Professor Emerita of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona and currently holds a distinguished visiting appointment at the Michelle R. Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. An Emmy Award-winning filmmaker for Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, and founding co-editor of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. Her publications include the Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology, When Monsters Speak, a Susan Stryker reader, which you should acquire as well, and the multi-volume Transgender Studies Reader and Transgender History. Her auto-theoretical intellectual history of the gender concept, entitled Changing Gender, is forthcoming from Farrar Straus Giroux in August 2026. Susan, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Paul. It's really great to be here. Good to be with you, audience, and Hill. Always a pleasure to see you. Just a quick comment. Yeah, I do remember having that conversation with you about Erickson and being so credulous that his brain would fall out, and that wasn't my characterization of Erickson, but I did an oral history with someone who had known him in Louisiana when he was still quite young before he transitioned in the 19 late 40s or early 50s, and that was her perspective, and that she was from a very sort of political Marxist background, and she had no truck, with all of this, mumbo jumbo stuff, and that she had known Reed through more of the political circles he ran in at the time through his then partner. And it was my interview informant who said, like, I said, well, what was he like at the time? And it was like, oh, it's like he always, believed in, the wildest things. He was, so credulous that his brain would fall out, that he just kind of wanted to believe in a beyond that was accessible to him, and that he was pursuing it. So, um, so anyway, yeah, I mean, I tend to take a more, I would say, ethnographic approach and go like, huh, that is what Reed Erickson actually believed, and I found it interesting, particularly because I have my own psychedelic practice, and it's like I don't dismiss out of hand some of the things that Reed learned from what it was that he was doing. I had planned to speak entirely extemporaneously today, but after listening to Hill, it shamed me, and I thought, oh, I have to find something to read from my book. I think I found something that I will share in just a few minutes. But I wanted to address the question that Paul posed at the beginning in introducing us, like to think about what is the relationship between gender transition and psychedelia. And I thought that was a great question for me to address because the book that he mentioned, Changing Gender, which will be out in August, it is, like I said, a it's written in a more sort of experimental style, but it is a intellectual history of the concept of gender. And to again bounce off something that Hill said, the conventional story of gender is that, as a social scientific concept, is that it emerges in the 1950s, and that there's actually a very good book by Jennifer Gurman called Gender, A Genealogy of an idea or a concept. I forget the exact subtitle. But on the first page of that book, she says to the effect, before the 1950s, gender was a word that referred to relationships between words rather than relationships between people. And then she kind of attributes this shift from a grammatical use of the word gender to a social scientific use of gender to John Money, the pedoendocrinologist at Johns Hopkins, who made his name doing work with intersex kids, and then later went on to work with trans patients. That money is widely assumed to be the person who popularizes this use of the word gender, and then it takes off from there and goes into uh, psychology and psychiatry and medicine. And from there, it goes into feminist social scientific writing. And then it goes into the women's movement by the 1970s. And then trans people are picking it up, and so on and so forth. But part of what I discovered working on changing gender is that there were people well before John Money who used the word gender exactly the way that he used it as a concept to talk about the relationship between a psychological sense of self, a gender identity, um, and a social gender role and a biological sex. So that sort of tripartite model of identity, embodiment, role that's attributed to money and called, gender system. Uh, I found, I found uses of gender to mean that well back into the 1840s, mostly coming out of phrenology. And if we have time to talk about that, we can. I don't want to get into that part of the gender history today, because there was this other guy, Madison Bentley, who was the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychology, very prominent psychologist in his day, who wrote on like he was using the word gender as part of a developmental psychological theory of how we become the people that we each become, using the word gender exactly the way Money would use it, and in many ways anticipating Money's theories of gender identity acquisition, at least a decade before Money was writing. And what I found fascinating about Bentley is that when he writes about how he says, when I use the word gender, sort of what I mean by that is what Margaret Mead meant by sex roles, and but it's like, it's not so much sex that we're talking about, which is, the biology of the body, so much as, we're talking about, identity and role. And so that set me off down the path of tracing kind of the concept of gender avant la lettre, so to speak, gender in all but name, and finding this like theory of gender that's usually dated to the second half of the 20th century, finding the antecedents of that in the work of Margaret Mead in particular, but also in other cultural anthropologists. Excuse me. Of other cultural anthropologists, most of whom had been trained by Franz Boas at Columbia, the whole Boasian school of cultural rather than more biologistic anthropology. And, I think it's very difficult to separate out the gender concept from the culture concept. I mean, the culture concept just sort of being that, how do we explain differences between different kinds of peoples and social organizations and ways of life? Is like, is it because of innate biological differences between the races, or is it about culture? Is it about practice? Is it nurture rather than nature? And just the whole cultural model of we become the specific kinds of persons that we become because of the practices that we use to engage with other people, kind of the routine practices of everyday life. They enculturate us, they culture us in a particular way. And so the gender concept is really directly related to that. Um, One of the things that, I don't think this is news, is that a lot of that cultural anthropological model came out of these anthropologists observing indigenous cultures, particularly North American indigenous cultures, and observing, what they were calling role diversity there in ways that did not line up with modern Eurocentric ideas. And it's like that sense of needing a critical vocabulary to talk about what they observed in indigenous cultures and translate that into science. It's like that's where gender comes from as a concept. I really see it as a form of extraction, of epistemic extraction from social scientists trying to make sense of Native American cultures and Asian Pacific cultures. Uh, what is very curious to me is that these very same cultural anthropologists who are laying the foundations for the gender concept are also some of the earliest Western scientific researchers into psychedelia. Um, uh, Boaz's student Ruth Benedict, who was later, president of the American Anthropological Association, she did work on the Southwest Puebloan cultures, including the peyote ritual. She introduced her friend and colleague Alfred Kroeber, who was another Boasian. Kroeber was a specialist in Native California cultures, founded the anthropology department at UC Berkeley. She introduced him to the use of peyote. She encouraged Margaret Mead to also experiment with peyote. And Margaret Mead's second book after coming of age in Samoa was an ethnography of a Native American church congregation in Omaha, Nebraska, and looking at the uptake of sort of the transformation of the peyote ritual into a Christian sacrament in the Native American church. Um, anyway, so the connections between psychedelia research and gender research go well back into the early 20th century. Um, One additional point I want to make before I read a passage to you from the forthcoming book is the very same people who were experimenting with psychedelics and studying psychedelic use and using the gender concept as part of a cultural anthropological practice. They were the same people who laid the foundations for cybernetics in the mid 20th century. And if we understand cybernetics as excuse me, as sort of like a system whose outputs get fed back into it as an input in such a way that it changes the operation of the system, or that you can sort of tweak the algorithm and get, different desired outputs from how you're managing the circulation of, inputs and outputs in the cybernetic system. In a sense, it's like that's the model of culture right there. It's like, isn't that what culture does? It's like you change the practices that you do. You kind of change the kinds of people that are outputs at the end, uh, and that the very same people who are theorizing gender and are interested in psychedelics, it's like they are um, developing this sort of cybernetic model of personhood that no, I'm sort of losing my train of thought here, but let me bring it back to the point here. Like the very same people who were doing cultural anthropology and cybernetics and psychedelics, a lot of them were connected to each other through the Macy Foundation, which also funded research not only in cybernetics but also in psychedelia. They were connected with the School for Social Analysis at Harvard University, run by Talcott Parsons. That was the department that trained John Money. That was also the department where Timothy Leary was later a psychologist. There's just such a density of connections between gender research, cybernetics, psychedelia, that it's hard to express it adequately. So anyway, I think I will stop with well, I guess one last point here. So to Paul's point, gender transitions relationship to psychedelia. It's like part of the mid 20th century sense of psychedelia was that it could be used as something to transform consciousness, either in that human potential movement kind of way, or more like in the brainwashing kind of way, that a lot of the early state interest in LSD, whose psychedelic properties were only discovered in 1943, was, can we use this in the Cold War as a mind control technology of some kind? And that approach to psychedelia totally fits into the cybernetic idea of sort of the engineerability of personhood. And John Money's sense of gender was very much that too. It's like he was trying to figure out, oh, how is it that a person becomes the kind of person that they are, and how can we intervene in that process to have them become the kind of person we want them to be? How can we engineer the outcome of gendered subjectivity? So these ideas about psychedelia and mid 20th century gender theory, I think, are rooted in the same sort of paradigm of the idea of a plasticity of self and its transformability, and that kind of embodied personhood is something that can be engineered or directed by your will and your desire. And so this, I think of as a very state-based way of thinking about engineering personhood dovetails in a interesting way with more of the new age and countercultural ideas about expanding consciousness and transformation of consciousness through using drugs. Um, what I would like to do now is just read a little bit from Changing Gender. There's a chapter where I try to address some of this history that I've just relayed to you, but to do it in a way where it's like I'm writing from within a psychedelic experience. So it's the most experimental chapter of the book, because I'm trying to do psychedelic writing while also telling a story, and it revolves around um, uh, an experience out in Joshua Tree. So I will read just a few pages from this, and then I'll look forward to opening up into questions and comments. The immense granite boulders in Joshua Tree National Park come to more than life for me on LSD, to reveal themselves as acephalic divinities incarnate. Their skins of fine wrought golden fish scale, flashed with amethyst and vermilion, malachite streaked and quartzite studded, coruscate in the gentle breeze of the mind's eye. Nothing entitles me to be here, and yet the land presents itself and allows my presence. The land is generous that way, beyond all accounting, even to the uninvited. I am fixated with chemical intensity on what it means that I am here now, unable to turn away from all the pasts, vast and intimate, that have carried me to this moment. Psychedelics offer a method. They promote neuroplasticity, rearrange the pattern of the brain's electrical activity, and through that altered instrument of perception, allow a difference to present itself from beyond the mind's habitual way of interpreting experience. I don't think they need to be theorized much more deeply than that. Psychedelics have played a not insignificant role in the history of gender and transness. The same early 20th century cultural anthropologists who laid the groundwork for the social scientific gender concept also promoted psychedelics to modern Western audiences, often by romanticizing their relationship to Native American spiritual beliefs and practices. The archaeologist Mark Raymond Harrington who studied with Franz Boas at Columbia and was married to a descendant of the 19th century Seneca prophet Handsome Lake, introduced peyote to New York City's Bohemia in 1912 at a blowout party at the home of the influential arts patron Mabel Dodge Lujan, after which psychedelics became trendy among all the beautiful people as a supposed pathway to ancient and arcane wisdom. Harrington also wrote trashy pulp fiction under the pseudonym Ramon de las Cuevas. His 1924 short story for Weird Tales, Teoquitla the Golden, revolved around a swashbuckling Indiana Jones-style archaeological explorer who discovers a lost remnant of the Aztec Empire in the remote Mexican highlands. When the explorer inadvertently contributes to the suicide of the emperor's daughter, he's given a choice of dying immediately by sacrifice to the war god Huitzilopochtli, or of becoming a living sacrifice to the goddess Sentiotl, the All-Mother. Preferring life, he chooses the latter, which turns out to mean that he is transformed into a woman by having plant-based hormones produced through native ethnobotanical knowledge injected into his bloodstream. Ruth Benedict, Franz Boas's former student and later colleague at Columbia, not only wrote on the peyote ritual in Puebloan cultures, she used peyote herself, as did Alfred Kroeber at Berkeley. So did Margaret Mead, who in 1932 published an ethnography of a congregation in Nebraska of the Native American Church. And so did Gregory Bateson, who, through his work with the national security apparatus during World War II, encouraged the CIA to experiment with LSD as a mind-controlling, brainwashing truth serum in the early days of the Cold War. The Macy Foundation funded conferences on neuropharmacology, including the use of psychedelics. Modern Western ideas about psychedelics as a tool for the transformation or manipulation of consciousness are rooted in the same beliefs about the engineerability of personhood that informed the 20th century cybernetic version of gender, and that now fuel the hype about the pharmaceuticalization of other psychedelic substances. Psychologist Timothy Leary, the acid guru of the 60s, was a faculty member in Harvard's Department of Social Relations, where he urged a generation to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Harry Benjamin used to dose his trans patients on acid back before it was illegal to see if their gender identities persisted while tripping, which he considered to be a good indicator that they were true transsexuals rather than cross-dressers or drag queens. For what it's worth, mine does. Reed Erickson, the trans man and philanthropist who bankrolled Benjamin and the university-based clinics and underwrote a lot of social services and legal advocacy for trans people in the 60s and 70s, and was a next-level psychonaut, an early advocate of off-label uses of ketamine as a tool for inner exploration. An engineer by training as well as a seeker of esoteric knowledge, he was a proponent not just of medico-legal sex change, but of what he called spiritual transsexualism. Physical sex change was not rocket science. Snip, snip, tuck, tuck, inject this drug, sign this paper, and presto changeo. Achievement of social transition to another gender unlocked. Spiritual transsexualism was more ineffable. It was not about changing the body alone. It wasn't necessarily concerned with gender in a strictly masculine-feminine sense. It aimed at an ongoing transformation of consciousness through practices that might involve shamanism, meditation, magic mushrooms, astral projection, out-of-body experiences, and deep, dark dives into the K-hole. I've had a regular psychedelics practice for years. Ideally, I like to travel 4 times annually around the solstices and equinoxes. I've had some big trips, including the classic ego-dissolving one with everything experience. If that's what dying is like, I am not afraid of dying. I have wandered in awe through ancient redwoods teeming with little forest spirits who tend them, watch rainbow-hued serpents arcing in and out of the beach sand where a river empties into an ocean to weave the land into existence. Felt earth energy conduct itself with orgasmic intensity from the soles of my feet on wet grass up through the crown of my head. Seen sunsets filled with colored lights beyond the accustomed spectrum, and looked up later to see those same vivid hues encircling every star in the sky. I am reluctant to label such experiences mere hallucination. I understand them as a line of flight to becoming more than human with something that exists beyond myself, the conceptual packaging of which has gone all loosey-goosey. Psychedelic experiences contain elements of something real. Feelings, for sure, at the very least. Feelings are always real when you feel them. I'm sitting today amidst fields of granite rolling like the sea, open to whatever difference my chemical teacher will show me, whatever it will enable me to feel. I'm atop an enormous undulating goddess body of rock with Mimi, encircled by our friends and the dancing Joshua trees who extend their many-fingered limbs ecstatically towards the sun. Some of us are tripping, others are not. I'm maybe 3 hours in, not yet peaking, but getting there. We are all listening to one another's stories of our ancestors coming to this continent. The Polish honey peddler struck down by cholera, whose widow took their children to live with relatives on New York City's Lower East Side. The one who managed to get all the dining room furniture out of the apartment in Vienna and shipped to the States just before the Anschluss in 1938. Mimi's traveled with her 8 great-grandparents to the shtetls they immigrated from in the 19th century. We've traveled there together, she and I, placed stones on broken markers atop neglected graves, visited derelict synagogues, desecrated and unroofed, whose empty insides now open to an endless Belarusian sky. My own ancestors came here from Scotland mostly so long ago that no memories of a homeland have survived in any of the family stories passed down to me. No actual histories, just fictions. Trying to find a good place to get out of here. Um, and anyway, there's some further ruminations on family history in relation to land and being uninvited. Um, and I'd say to acknowledge that you are a stranger in a strange land feels like an ethically necessary first step for anyone who has ever arrived somewhere as an uninvited guest. When I try to unsettle from the inside what gender has come to mean and do, I'm orienting myself in the direction of a desired world to come. Pulling up roots relating differently to place and history and others feels like the right horizon to head towards. Get up now, a wordless whisper prompts. Go further, tug harder, loose gender's roots from your body, from the soil. I wander away from my friends. My body here alive and interlaced with ill-cut syntax drips with sweat that cools my skin, brisk wind beneath a brightly blazing winter sun, and strains to slip its chain of words. I wander. Groping tendrils of perception find and work the narrow gap between find and work the narrow gap the molecule has pried apart between this world and another way for it to be, so that alterity can wing its way towards awareness suddenly, a vagrant cormorant, orange-billed, rising from the desert floor. I wander. I wander in search of that bird. That way, maybe, over there towards that interesting arrangement of boulders in the distance. And I will stop there and open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Susan. Where was that reading from?
That is from my forthcoming book, Changing Gender, Chapter 8.
Tremendous.
So
Okay.
after I kind of go through a lot of the history, it's like Chapter 8 of Is that right? Chapter 9. Chapter 9 of 10 chapters is the acid trip and Joshua Tree chapter where it's like I'm using psychedelics and like retelling like my both like autobiographical family history with like a longer term like history of gender as part of a settler colonial epistemology and like what do you do when you find yourself on the land and like how do you like try to rip that up and where does it leave you because like you're still here and blah it's the most uh I felt like in writing that chapter it was like I was playing the piano and like that was the biggest stretch I could get in my hands, the broadest chord, the hardest reach to try to bring together the longest temporal span with the most intensely personal subjective recounting of the experience and to use tripping as the mechanism. I actually did drop acid many times in Joshua Tree, but it's like in that chapter, it's like wanting to use the psychedelic experience as like a literary device that allowed me to like move between these different registers of memory and thought and analysis.
Psychedelics applied as a method.
Yeah, psychedelics as method.
Um, because we are here at the Center for the Study of World Religions, or at least I am, physically. I must ask at least one question specifically about religion. And this is, I think, particularly around this sort of the complications, Hill, that you raised around the human potential movement flavor of spiritual practice. Um, Perhaps this is incredibly compelling to some, fair enough. If this is not particularly compelling, and that was the sense that I got from you, Hill, and this is, I think I shared that sense. But one is still curious about, to borrow a line from Spinoza, what a body can do or about the role that spiritual practice may play. What other options might one find on the table? And I think this is another way to ask, what is there to recuperate from Erickson's spiritual transsexualism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also want to, I guess I'm going to start by hedging a little bit. I think that I have been very interested in Esalen and also very interested in the human potential movement more broadly because I find most of it really compelling and actually was very invested in some of the core tenets without even really, like I mentioned I was raised by hippies, right? So I like kind of inherited them without even really thinking too critically about it. And I know you were maybe going to ask a question about Deleuze later, but one of the things, but I want to mention it now, one of the really transformative things that happened when I encountered the work of Deleuze and Guattari together, right, Anti-Oedipus and later A Thousand Plateaus, and I read them back to back one summer and then kept reading them over a period of years.
Big
Um,
summer.
what? Big
That's a
summer.
big summer.
Yeah, that's pretty much all I did, honestly. Um, but I, part of what was so exciting about that work is they were giving sort of conceptual language that translated in my philosophy PhD student brain to some of the sort of spiritual investments that I'd absorbed just through the sort of ether of my upbringing without ever accounting for. And it was in a different register, so I wasn't as allergic to it as I would have been if it was my mother telling me to meditate, which she did all the time, and I was always like, no, 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 I don't want this. And then later was like, she has a point. So I don't want to be, I don't want to paint myself as like uber skeptical of the human potential movement, but I do think the history of it is complicated. And some of that has to do with some of what I pointed out in the last part of side effects. Some of it, I think Susan sort of gets at through this story of, Joshua Tree and rethinking one's relationship to the land via, right, one's experience as an uninvited settler. Um, the sort of roots of Esalen were not, I think, were shaped by a politic that was not a politic that I shared, and were mostly, white, well-heeled, um, and engaging in a kind of knowledge translation that was deeply appropriative in some respects, but then also really, really linked up to attempts to carve out a specifically sort of Western history of esotericism and recuperate that knowledge base. Um, but they were also very keen to glom onto certain scientific developments in relatively uncritical ways if they had to do with neuroplasticity or right sort of developments in the cybernetic imagination. So there was a relationship to science that I found as somebody who sort of cut their teeth on feminist science and technology studies a little bit too uncritical. Um, so, it's complicated for me. I think there's a lot there that's compelling. And so I don't want to be dismissive and just say, well, I don't think there are any pure practices, right? When it comes to spiritual exploration, whether you're engaging it in more conventional and traditional ways or ways that are more sort of esoterically inclined. There's always baggage. But I think the history of Esalen, and I'll stop rambling after this, is actually a testament to how this is transformed. I think that as an institute, I mean, they're still around, you know, folks are still going there. They've become more democratic, I think, in the way that they make themselves available to a broader swath of folks. And their programming is really pretty interesting these days in attempting to grapple with questions of race and settler coloniality and histories of appropriation and queerness and transness in a way that just wasn't the case historically. So it's not a static institute, but it's also the case that, in the 70s, there was some really horrifically right transphobic and sexist shit that was coming out of those spaces. Um, and Erickson's such an interesting figure to me because he had to be absorbing that, but at the same time, he was very much embedded in those worlds and hearing all of the shit that both the human potential guys and most of them, not all of them, but many of them were guys, and the sexologists were saying about trans people, which was not always great. So anyway, I'll stop there. I didn't really answer your question, Paul, but there's probably a lot more that I imagine Susan could say about this.
We can always circle back to what a body can do. That is a question we never stop asking.
Um, I don't know if how deep I'm going to go down the Spinoza hole there, but just to bounce off Hill for a second, one of the other early sort of early influential trans figures, Virginia Prince, who is sort of best remembered for founding some of the early sort of cross-dresser rights and cross-dresser social groups in the 1950s and 60s, publisher of Transvestia magazine. She was a diehard human potential movement person. I mean, in the 60s when she's I would say sort of transitioning from sort of like old school cross-dresser into what gets called a transgender person in the sense of somebody who socially changes their gender in an ongoing way, but resists certain kinds of medicalization that, she was opposed to genital surgery. As she's like shifting into that self-described transgender, using that word identity, it's like she's going to Esalen, she's like going to nude encounter groups. It's like I haven't found her discussing using psychedelics, but she's very much in that milieu. And a lot of the early trans people, sort of like in the history of medicalizing trans bodies, like back into the mid 20th century, a lot of the people who came out of that world and were prominent trans activists, it's like they were all witchy woo people. I mean, the new agey underbelly of mid 20th century trans culture is something that has not been explored well enough. But if you dig into the archive, it's there. And, as you mentioned, AJ Lewis has done some really great work. People who work more in the arts field, like, and there's that anthology, uh, Trans History and 99 Objects and Trapdoor. There's a lot of visual art that really gets into the kind of the esoterica that underpins a lot of the more normie looking trans sociopolitical activism. You asked like what can a body do question about Spinoza. I think the main insight there is to just really recognize that our identities and our embodiments are changeable parts of a reconfigurable milieu, to use that Deleuzian language. And that boundaries between self and others and place, uh, um, where you draw the line between self and others. It's like how your like desires and affects, lead you towards, encounter with one part of the milieu and to avoid another part. It's like it's all relational and it's all changeable. So what a body can do depends on how it is connected to others and milieu, right? And so you change that and you are changing self and you're changing relationship to self, other, and place. And it's all experimental. Just like it's not everything is possible, but most things are more changeable than you would imagine. And that's exactly why I think psychedelics can be a method. It's not like I feel like you use them and you get some kind of revealed truth, but you have an experience of relating differently. And that it gives you a difference that you can work with, that real change can come from. And your audience today probably has read this book more closely than I have, but I'm a huge fan of Arun Saldana's book, Psychedelic White, about the Goa trance dance community and what he calls the viscosity of race. Because it uses this explicitly Deleuzo-Guattarian affect theory, Spinoza's informed critical framework and just, like leans into that idea of cultural beliefs about psychedelia promoting a kind of plasticity that is deeply linked to whiteness. And the idea of whiteness is something that is more transformable than of color. And so, when I read that book, 10 or more years ago, there were just a lot of light bulbs and connected dot things that went off for me.
Yeah,
We
and I just
had
want to mention, oh,
oh,
sorry. I
go
just want
ahead,
to
Bill.
mention that I really lean on that book in the last chapter of Side Affects, which is on sort of whiteness and healing and trans-psychedelia. And it was because in 2019, I had invited Susan to come to Penn State to give a talk. And
Yes.
and then we
Uh,
went out to dinner and Susan was like, "Have you?" And I was just starting to think about the new age stuff. I was reading some works from these Southern collectives that were doing sort of queer and trans new agey things. And Susan was like, "You should read this book, Psychedelic White." And I was like, "All right." So I got it immediately because when Susan tells you to read something, you go read it. Um, and I was like, wow. And same. I mean, it completely blew my mind and named a lot of what I'd found troubling, sort of that I've already mentioned about my upbringing and the sort of limitations of the epistemologies and cosmologies that were at work there. Well, at the same time, those cosmologies made possibility for transness in a way that others didn't. And that was really compelling. So, yeah, just wanted to mention that.
I'll just jump in quickly. Let's say you're talking about your family upbringing. Do you know an Australian artist named Archie Berry?
Yeah, I talked with Archie before Archie went to Victoria, and Archie
Okay,
said
yeah,
that they
cool.
talked to you too. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's somebody else who came from, I don't know, hippie background, but certainly like a Western esoterica background, and they do a lot of work with their transness and that family history, and they've worked in the Erickson archive and have made, some of Erickson's work part of their work. I find it very compelling.
Yeah, yeah, same. I'm actually going to see Archie this summer because I'll be in Australia in May. I'm
Yay,
excited.
say hello.
I will.
Let's see here. We have a question from the audience for Hill. Thank you so much for this and sharing your incredible work. I am in recovery, and in part, I came to terms with my addictive tendencies and habits via my draw to archival subjects who were trans and then got sober. I just kept writing about trans people who found each other and then supported each other to get sober. And I thought they were the coolest. And then I went, oh. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share more about your thoughts on the connections between transness, addiction, and community building.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. But I will say, really briefly, I definitely understand doing archival work and then having these epiphanies about your motivations for doing them. And I will say, with Erickson, it's not the same sort of thing, but there's something about my draw to the Erickson archives that's very much, and I will admit this openly, like, Dad? Is this Dad? Maybe this is Dad. Like, um, so I absolutely get that those recognitions about your motivations and investments for archival work. And I think it's really important to dignify them and sort of think with them and through them in, critical and reflexive ways. But also, I do think that work, some of us we operate in certain ways where work is a mechanism of avoidance. I'm definitely one of those people. So I get that too. Um, I think, it's if you're doing trans-archival work, you come across addiction all the time. You come across, I mean, it's just like a fact of the work, and it's a pretty banal fact of trans living, which is not to say that there's a unique or special relationship between drug use and transness. I think, addiction is a super common phenomenon. Um, but something I've thought about is, I mentioned being in recovery is an alcoholic, is the lure of dissociation for trans subjects, right? And the things that I was always drawn to substance-wise were depressants, right? So it was mostly alcohol. It was not psychotropic drugs. Never had a problem with those. Found them fun. That was pretty much it. I'm down with the method, right? Like I think you don't need to think about it too deeply beyond that. Um, but it's the depressants, right? Painkillers, and alcohol that were really alluring, and it was mostly because I realized that they enabled me to shut out the world when I didn't want to deal with the hostility of the world. Um, and I don't think we need to have a stigmatized relationship to that. I think that's just a fact, and those substances are really useful for doing that. But there's also a risk that comes along with them. Um, but another way to sort of lose yourself in relationship to the milieu that you may find yourself in is archival work, actually. So I've thought a lot about, and I've written just a very little about archival work as a form of disassociation. And as I don't want to say it's like a replacement addiction, but it fills for me some of that, like needing to sort of estrange myself from the world because I feel the force of its impingement too much sometimes. It's great to go into a reading room where nobody's supposed to talk to you. Um, and to feel, and if you're doing trans-related research, it's great to be like, my people, but I actually don't have to interface with anybody while I'm doing this. Um, so I'll stop there, but it's a great question. It's provocative and interesting for sure to think through.
Susan, anything to add?
Um, no, no. Just flap my gums about something else
Well,
soon.
I will take the archive cue here to ask a question of my own. Both of you have deep experience working in archives, perhaps even some of the same archives. Um, is there any advice that you give to folks who are interested in archival work, particularly on trans or psychedelic histories? How do you work with this sort of dissociative mass? And these sorts of moments that you described, Hill, in the Erickson archive, where you're sort of recognizing an obsession and also sort of unsure what to do with this mass.
Susan, do you want to start?
Well, the thoughts that were prompted for me, it's like I immediately thought about the tension between the way whoever composed the archive organized the material versus what might draw me to it. And so, like, I'm always looking for those places where the material starts to exceed the taxonomy. That's a big part of it. And I like a phrase that I learned from Mel Chen, who's another sort of gender, race, queer disability studies scholar. Mel writes about what they call the feral archive. And I like when I find something and it starts to get really weedy and it's like is going some it's like, oh, like I didn't think about that. I mean, like some of the stuff I was kind of blathering on about earlier, it's like when I started to see the connections in the intellectual history between psychedelia, cybernetics, gender theory, you know, Cold War notions of the engineerability and plasticity of the self. I just felt like my head was exploding, and I wanted to follow all of those little t tendencies, you know. So yeah, I think thinking about the feral archive or the mycelial archive or whatever you want to call it, it's like the really interesting stuff comes and you like find something in the archive and you follow it outside the way it's been presented to you.
I think this is particularly true in collections that are in someone's home or something like that, where you really have the feral quality where, you might have some things in filing cabinets with great labels that have dates and other things that is like a repurposed box of loose stuff. I found one folder once. The label every other folder had pretty good labels or no label at all. One just had the drawing of a whale. And it had some of the most interesting things I came across. Um, Hill, anything on the archive?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the archival side quest is like the most exciting thing in the world, honestly. Um, so, so I'm all about the Feral Archive. And I also want to mention, like, it takes a lot of time, right? Anybody who does archival work knows that. But I've been thinking a lot about the material conditions of trans scholarship in relationship to archival work because it is such a luxury to be able to take all of these side quests and have these sort of galaxy brain moments and then do the work, the slow, very slow work of trying to piece together context, especially when you have these instances where, yeah, something's in a box with a or a folder with a drawing of a whale on it. And you're like, what world is this emanating from? I do not know what to do with it. And it takes years sometimes to build that world of context. And you're always unsure of its construction, I think, too. So there's a real sort of it's necessary to just be willing to be totally wrong or to think you have a real read or a critique or whatever on something and then just have that totally exploded um, kind of over and over again, right? And I think that's one of the beauties of doing that work, but it's also tricky.
Hill, can I ask you a question? I know that you had gotten some funding to pull together like groups of trans scholars who are doing archival research and sort of doing it together in different archives. I was just talking to Meryl Ream last night at an event in Berkeley. And I think that since we're talking about archives, I'd personally be curious to hear more about what that process is and what's coming out of it and how it's changed, you and the other people who were doing it and what you're finding and yada yada.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Susan. Yeah, there's actually at least one member of the cohort of that project here right now in the chat, or at least Chris was here. Anyway, I don't mean to call Chris Lee out. But the project is amazing. So it's in its second year now, but it started last year, and we went to the Transgender Archives at the University of Victoria, and it was a cohort. It was Merle and myself and my colleague Sam Tenorio, and then 10 early career scholars in trans studies. And we just, crashed the reading room and we're there for 2 weeks together, looking through materials together, being way too loud for a reading room, I think, conventionally. And one of the sort of immediate things that emerged from doing that collaborative research had to do with the sort of limits of the collection in Victoria, but also all of the sort of like counter-grained ways people were finding to navigate through the real significant limitations of what's there. So I don't know if folks know too much about like the history of the materials that have come to be at the Transgender Archives at the University of Victoria, but there are a couple of issues that come up right away. And one is, what does it mean to build a transgender archive? What's excluded, right? When you set those parameters around what an archive is and who it's representing, what materials are there. Um, so very quickly, the cohort was like tuned into those limitations and and thought about how that had shaped the sort of policy of accessions and who was courted to donate there. Um, but I think that folks also I mean, having the space to be collaborative and sort of iteratively like decompressing about what you're finding in the archives over 2 weeks just produced a ton of collaborations that are ongoing. So there's some work that folks in the cohort are doing around I'm gonna get the name wrong, but it's like Black, Indigenous, Trans of Color Histories Lab. So they're putting out some work as part of that lab that stems from this collaborative research. Um, and they're also, yeah, we just canvassed so much material over the 2 weeks collectively that would have never come onto people's radar. And folks were just sharing, everybody knew each other's projects. So folks were just sharing materials with one another. Um, it was extremely productive. I'm rambling at this point. I could go on and on, but the project's been incredible. It's a 3 year long project. The work that's coming out of it is fucking amazing. So, yeah, collaborative archival work and giving people resources to do it, awesome. We need more of it.
Is there anywhere people can keep a lookout for some of this work as it's published?
There will be. I won't say too
Okay.
much more about that, but yeah, there will be.
Stay
We've
tuned.
we've had to be a little on the down low because of the
The
environment.
budget. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of staying tuned, I had a question for you, Susan. During some interview you had done after When Monsters Speak had published, you mentioned that there is material enough for many more readers like it. I'm curious if you think there is enough material for a trans psychedelia reader.
Um, Well, I would say not from me. I mean, like that collection and When Monsters Speak. First of all, I have to thank Mackenzie Wark for curating that. Where that anthology came from was Mackenzie like paid me the great compliment and some social media things like, when I look back over, kind of where the conversation has been on trans, like at any given moment, Susan Stryker has something interesting to say, like might not agree with you or whatever, but it's like, but that I, was addressing a moment. And I thought, oh, heart emoji, thank you. And by the way, I had a grad student or a recently graduated PhD student who like needed some employment over the summer before they started a job in the fall. And I was able to pull together a little bit of money and have them digitize and clean up the digital text of all of this old stuff of mine that, was either like I lost it in a hard drive crash and I had a paper copy, or it was before, it's like when I was still working on an IBM Selectric typewriter or something. So anyway, I had them digitize everything. And so I just had like all of my, so like minor ephemeral writing in digital form. And I just said to Mackenzie, I said, you want to like edit this? And she said, yes. But her editorial choices were, I mean, I think it came out quite well. And I had the interesting experience of, like, oh, like I wrote that, that's my work, but I'm seeing it curated by somebody else. It's like going into a museum and go like, oh, I remember that old piece, and oh, look what you put that next to. It's like, huh, that's interesting. And so Mackenzie had a very particular vision. She didn't want to do like the Susan Stryker omnibus. It was there was kind of an argument in the collection that it started with a lot of the more subcultural community-based work I was doing in the 90s. I mean, stuff I published in like, like queer porn zines. I mean, just like, a lot of it was very sexually explicit. It was very explicit about BDSM and kink community. At that time in my life, it's like I thought, well, I'm never going to have a job in the academy. It's like, I don't care what I write about. I'm just going to put it all out there, man. Let your freak flag fly. And so it was that material. And then Mackenzie moved into the more, so like, how do we take these subcultural knowledges into academic institutions? How does this inform trans studies? And it was some of my writing on trans studies. And then it was like the whole series of articles on the Frankenstein article that I wrote in 1993, which was taken on a life of its own, and that I've been asked to comment on, pretty much every 10 years. So there's a whole collection of like that and responses to it. So it was in conversation with McKinsey who was saying, it's kind of like, like I could have done these other anthologies, could have done stuff like work on sort of history and theory of embodiment technologies, or, like I don't know how many art catalog essays I've written, or, where it's like, like I've just been dribbling the words out for, 35 years or so. So there could be more, you know, future volumes of collected writings. I don't have any immediate plans to do that. But my psychedelic writing, it's like, not so much, I mean, two or three, four pieces maybe. But I do think there is an anthology of trans-psychedelia, with many authors, to be made. I would love to see somebody do a trans-psychedelia issue of TSQ. I mean, I did that for 10 years. I am done with that. Moving on, you know, namaste to the people who are like picking that up. But I would love to see a trans psychedelia issue. Hill,
I mean, or Paul.
Andy, somebody. Uh,
It's a great idea, though. There's so
yeah,
much.
there's so
There's so
much
much.
cool stuff coming out now. Yeah.
There is certainly a trans psychedelia path through When Monsters Speak, no doubt. There's a line from the essay Los Angeles at Night of
Uh,
hormones were first coming on like a strong dose of acid that really, I mean, stuck with me as I wrote it
yeah.
down.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Um,
it's just like as a trans person who has done many kinds of like, medical and pharmacological things, and somebody who, is very open about my psychedelics use. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's all shot through, but it's very rare that I feel like I foreground the psychedelic question. Not rare, but it's like it's infrequent.
um, there is a question I think that is too big for our time left now that came to mind, inspired by Paul Preciado's Testo Junkie on the space between junkie and patient. But I will just leave that in the air for us all to think about, and another book to flag for our those following along at home, Testo Junkie classic. One question that I think is maybe a smaller question that we can come to a close on. How do each of you think that transgender studies could inform a similarly nascent field of psychedelic studies, which in many ways had its initial contours formed um, in by work in medicine and specifically psychiatry? Lessons learned from the formation of a field for this other field.
Mm.
Okay, I'll
Maybe,
jump in because I
Yeah,
jotted
please
down some
do.
notes when you asked me that question, but I'll be brief. I would say don't center the medicalization of the experience. That is like the main thing. It's like there's a difference between studying trans people and trans studies, and I think bringing in, we want to use Deleuze-Guattarian language, minor knowledges, minor literatures, nomad sciences rather than, state sciences, uh, drawing from feminisms of color, from queer of color studies, trans of color studies, disability, crip studies, like the idea of centering the knowledge that you know from how you live your body in the world, and the kinds of experiential and affective content that is always present, and bringing those minor knowledges, delegitimated knowledges, whatever, into dialogue with legitimated knowledges, the state knowledges, the disciplined knowledges. It's like it's in that tension between the two that I think the real, or not even the tension and synthesis and generativity of the encounter between those different frameworks is like it's where the real juice is.
Yeah, agreed. And I would just add, be really attentive to the infrastructure that needs to exist for that centering of marginalized knowledges to occur, and be sort of, yeah, iteratively reflecting on that and rebuilding it as you go.
well, thank you both so much. This has been a lovely evening for me, and I hope to those following along at home as well. Just a couple quick announcements before we close. We have an event the same date next month, the 26th of March. Online, we will be doing a book talk with Alex Giron on his new book, Global Ayahuasca, at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. And then in April, on the 10th and 11th, will be our annual conference, Psychedelic Intersections. The first time it's over 2 days, so it will be quite the affair. And speaking of great things going on at Esalen these days, Ramzi Fawaz, who is on the faculty at Esalen, is will be our opening keynote. So come for that or any of the other things that you might find in the program. Thank you all for joining us this evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are. And from Cambridge, we bid you all adieu.